Thank you so much. Well, welcome everyone. It's fantastic to have you here. This is really an important opportunity, I think, for us all together to talk about some really important trends that we're seeing on restrictions and social hostilities on religion. So I want to thank our hosts for this wonderful opportunity to gather, and I think especially on the heels of our first ever State Department ministerial on advancing religious freedom around the world that was sponsored and hosted by Secretary Pompeo in July. This is really a perfect time to come back and to look at the report and to really just take a deeper dive on what are the trends that we're seeing. And I think for those of us who are doing this work on a daily basis, whether we are supporting and working towards religious freedom here in this country, whether we're doing it through education or advocacy, whether we are focused on advancing religious freedom around the world in specific countries, whether we're working with those who have experienced violence, who have been imprisoned, perhaps working with families of those who have been killed in the name of their religion, because of their religion. We have a lot of work to do, and I think that became very clear through the ministerial, but those of us who are working on these issues know that we have a great deal of work to do to really raise the visibility of the people who are behind the statistics. But I also think it's incredibly important that we understand the context and we have the statistics and to really understand what the trends are and have an opportunity to really dig deep into that to figure out what is happening kind of globally and then in each of the countries where we are working, and then certainly in our own backyard where we have significant issues as well. And so we are so honored to have this conversation today with Dr. Katayoun Kishi, who is a research associate at Pew Research Center. She oversees the center's annual study on global restrictions on religion. Her previous work has included research topics such as identity politics and religion, international conflict, survey research, and food security. Before joining Pew Research Center, she held positions at USIP and the Office of Anwar Sadat Chair for Peace and Development at the University of Maryland. She earned a doctorate in government and politics with a concentration in comparative politics and qualitative methodology from the University of Maryland. She was the primary researcher for this report, which is named Global Uptick in Government Restrictions on Religion in 2016. Although the report was released on the 21st, it is incredibly in-depth. As I was rereading it again over the last few days, and I know that I have a lot of questions for her, and I know all of you will have a lot of questions on what do these trends mean, and you know, where are the red flags, where are the areas that we really need to focus our work. So for those of us who educate the public about religious freedom, those of us who are advocates in our communities, in the different countries we're working in for religious freedom, this is incredibly important information for all of us to be able to have, to read, to understand, so we can communicate it. And I think to have a conversation with her today about how we can communicate it effectively, whether we're working with governments, whether we're working with our own constituents, whether we're educating the publics, our neighbors, our family members on this. This is an important conversation to have, so thank you very much for giving us this opportunity. So she's going to give us a presentation for about 30 minutes, and then I'm going to kick off our discussion with a few questions that I have, and then we'll open it to all of you because I'm sure you have a number of questions as well. So help me give her a very warm welcome on this beautiful, even though it's cloudy, afternoon. I'm so glad we were able to come here, even though the hurricane, we weren't sure if it was going to happen, but it looks like we've dodged a bullet, which is great. So thank you for being here.
Thank you, Kristen. Hi, everyone. Wanted to run you through some of the main results that we had from our annual study, and then focus a little bit more deeply on the trend that we noticed in 2016 being nationalism, particularly in European countries. So how do you go about measuring religious freedom? So the absence of something being religious freedom. So as a researcher, and for the past 9 years at Pew, we've been measuring the opposite. So restrictions on religion. So places where religious freedom might be restricted in certain ways. So that's sort of the main topic that I'll be focusing on today. A few quick words about Pew Research Center that will sort of inform where this data come from. We are a nonpartisan, non-advocacy fact tank, is what we call ourselves. But that means that we don't take policy positions. We don't advocate for issues. We don't prescribe what we should be doing about religious freedom issues. We just present the data and then allow experts in the field to use that data as they see fit. We are a subsidiary of the Pew Charitable Trusts, and if this information is useful for you or interesting, or any of our other data might be useful for you, it's all available for free on our website. So each year, this religious restrictions project begins with a 12-week coding process. This is a period in which 5 different coders scour a variety of different sources to answer a series of questions about countries, and it results in 3 main products each year. The Government Restrictions Index, the Social Hostilities Index, and then a set of additional variables. And I'll go into depth about what each of those different indexes are and what they contain. This is what the coding instrument looks like. So essentially, we devised something that looks a lot like a survey. It's the same questions for every country. So things like, does the country have freedom of religion in its constitution? Every single country coders answer the same questions for every single country. And they sit down and they will look at the question. The question will have various answer options. Those answer options have a score assigned to them between 0 and 1. Each coder will look at it and decide on what the score should be and complete the entire questionnaire. Every country is coded by 2 different coders independently of each other. And then they get together in what we call the reconciling process, where they compare their answers. If there's any discrepancy in between the answers that they have decided on for a country, they then come to an agreement on what that answer should be. And this ensures that no one coder's individual biases are factored in. This is a list of the sources that we look at for every country. There's 18 different sources. Now, not every single country has 18 sources. Typically, smaller countries will not have all 18. They might only have the State Department Religious Freedom Report. But the countries that you hear about in the news that you sort of know have these religious freedom issues, they tend to have all 18 sources, and we read through all of them for information. If any sources contradict each other, we typically go with either the more detailed source, or we look at the more conservative estimate if it's estimating detentions or deaths or something like that. The only country that has a different source is the United States. The US does not have a State Department Religious Freedom Report for us to use, so we supplement all these other sources with the FBI's hate crime statistics each year, as well as the DOJ's religious freedom newsletters. So the first of those 3 products that I mentioned is the Government Restrictions Index. This is an index that looks at the ways in which national and local level governments might restrict religious freedom in a country. And this can be through laws and policies. It can also be through physical force or coercion. We'll look at 20 different indicators or 20 different questions. And those things vary from, does the government allow for religious freedom in its constitution? Does it harass members of certain religious groups? Does it favor or give benefits to a certain religious group over others? Does it officially recognize a religion as its state religion? And so on. Each of those different indicators has a maximum score of 1, like I mentioned earlier. So we add all those up, we divide it by 2, and we're left with a score between 0 and 10, with 10 indicating the highest levels of government restrictions. Now for each of those 20 different indicators, we don't weight them any differently. So you get the same amount, it affects your score essentially the same, whether you benefit a certain country or you're harassing members of or you benefit a certain religious group and you're harassing members of a religious group. We don't offer a weighting system because we don't put subjective sort of outside influences on the data, but we always encourage researchers, if they have a specific focus or if they think that perhaps offering privileges to a certain religious group should not count as a restriction, we welcome them to recalculate the index. Looking separately from government, so we're looking at individuals and social groups. How do they interact with religious groups? How do religious groups themselves interact with other religious groups in a country? For this one, we have 13 different indicators. There'll be things like, was there mob violence related to religion that year? Were there religion-related terrorism in the country or conflict in the country? Were there tensions between religious groups in the country, and so on. Since there's 13 indicators, add them up, divide by 1.3 to result in a 0 to 10 point index. Again, 10 being the highest score you can have on the social hostilities index. Each year, we also code for some additional variables. These are not included in the index. That's because we trend the index from year to year, and if we were to introduce new questions in a given year, we then cannot compare it to previous years. So we keep all of these steps separate, and they just depend on what we see in the news, what we think might be of interest to policymakers, the scholars. So we've looked at blasphemy laws in the past. Most recently, we looked at which countries have an official state religion versus a favored unofficial state religion versus strict separation of church and state. These findings will be published in separate reports throughout the year and shorter blog style posts. Okay, so now that you know what these indexes are and what I mean when I talk about scores, these are the latest findings. 2016 is the latest year for which we have data from our sources. So keep in mind, this is all from a couple of years ago. What we found is that when we categorize countries into 4 main buckets, we have low, moderate, high, or very high levels of restrictions in a country. When you look at those top 2 categories, high or very high levels, 28% of countries had high or very high levels of government restrictions in 2016. That was an increase from 25% the year before. When you look at social hostilities, it remained pretty much unchanged. 27% in 2015, 27% of countries in 2016 had high or very high levels of social hostilities. When you look at the average across the globe, so 198 countries is what's included in our study each year, the average score for government restrictions was a 2.8 in 2016, very small increase from 2.7 the year before. The average score for social hostilities was a 1.8, a very small decrease in 2016. What this really, the point that this drives home is that yes, you have over a quarter of countries that fall into the high, very high bracket of restrictions, but by and large, most countries in the world have low to moderate levels of restrictions on religion. So it is important to focus on those countries that have high levels, but it's also, for context, useful to think about the globe as a whole and to remember that most countries are outside of those groups. Speaking of the whole world, this is basically what government restrictions look like in 2016. You can see the red and the orange are areas of very high or high levels of government restrictions. Mostly concentrated in the Middle East, North Africa, and Asian countries, places like Russia, China, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, Egypt, sort of the ones that you hear about in the news that you would expect to have higher levels of government restrictions. You can see that generally sub-Saharan Africa, the Americas, have low to moderate levels of government restrictions. These are the countries that fell into our very high top category. So of those 4 buckets, the very highest one. There was a couple more countries that were added to this list in 2016. So places like Burma, because of their actions towards Rohingya Muslims in 2016. Places like Laos passed a decree that severely restricted religious freedom in 2016. And then you have some of the countries that remained part of this category, even though they did see increases in score. So Turkey, for example, had a small increase in their score in 2016, but remained in this very high category regardless. And a lot of that was due to the mass detentions of members of the Gulen movement. Switching gears to the social hostilities side, you can see that a lot of the same players also have high social hostilities. So places like Middle East, North Africa, some Asian countries. And by and large, what we find is that when a country has high government restrictions, they also have high social hostilities and vice versa. We don't know what's causing what, if one is causing the other. There's no statement of causation necessarily. But we do know that they're correlated. Typically, when one is high, the other one is high as well. There are certain exceptions to this that are quite notable. So China, for example, very high levels of government restrictions, the highest in the world in 2016, but low levels of social hostilities. Now, the Chinese government might tell you that because they severely restrict religious practice in the country, it leads to lower levels of social hostilities. We're not entering that discussion, but that's what the data show. You have the opposite in some places. Australia, for example, has very low levels of government restriction on religion, but had high levels of social hostilities in 2016. There were quite a few protests, particularly targeting Muslims in Australia in 2016. Some of the same, some countries have higher levels of social hostilities in regions. So the Americas, for example, typically low levels of government restrictions, but places like the United States have high levels of social hostilities. That the U.S.'s score is largely driven by hate crimes targeting Muslims, targeting Jews. Looking at the countries that fall into the very high category for social hostilities, Bangladesh was the only country to newly enter that category in 2016. There were increased incidents of violence against religious minorities by social groups and individuals in 2016. Places like India continued to have very high levels of social hostilities, and in fact, India had the highest levels of social hostilities in the world in 2016. Looking regionally, I sort of touched on this before, but so the Middle East, North Africa, year in and year out, has the highest levels of government restrictions. These scores represent the average score in a country in that region. So typically, the Middle East, North Africa has higher scores than other regions. Asia follows it closely. The Americas tends to have the lowest levels of government restrictions each year. Looking at social hostilities, again, Middle East, North Africa has the highest level of social hostilities. You can see that it peaked in the years around the Arab Spring and is now leveling back off again to pre-Arab Spring levels. Some places like Europe have seen increases and fluctuations in recent years, and the Americas tends to have quite low levels of social hostilities, despite places like the US having high levels. As a whole, as a region, the average is fairly low. Each year, we also take a look at the most populous countries in the world. This is the top 25 most populous countries. They inhabit, or about 3/4 of the world's population live in these countries. So we feel like it's important to look at them, although it would be misleading to say that 3/4 of the world's population face the same restrictions in these countries. By and large, religious minorities face the brunt of these restrictions in these countries, so it's not quite accurate to say that all of them look at this equally. But when we look at the highest overall levels, so taking government, taking social, maybe combining their scores, looking at the overall levels, we found that Egypt, Russia, India, Indonesia, and Turkey had the highest levels overall of restrictions on either index. Looking just at government, China had the highest score not only among the 25 most populous, but in the world as a whole. Same goes for India. India had the highest levels of social hostilities in the world, not only among the most populous, but in general as well. Another analysis that we do each year is looking at where specific religious groups are harassed around the world. So typically, Christians are harassed in the largest number of countries each year. Christians are also the largest religious group in the world. They exist in the most countries around the world. So we did analyze last year, for example, the proportion of the religious group's population that live in countries where members of their groups are harassed. When you look at it that way, Jews, Hindus, about 99% of their population live in countries where members of those religious groups are harassed. Not that all of them are harassed, but that those incidents occur. So in 2016, Christians and Muslims were harassed in 144 and 142 countries around the world. There was an increase in the number of countries where Jews were harassed, which is notable given the very small global population of Jews. And then slightly newer analysis that we've been doing is looking at countries where the unaffiliated are harassed. So these are atheists, agnostics, people who say they don't have a religion or don't practice a religion. What we found is that 14 countries around the world, the unaffiliated were harassed. My guess is that this is underreported. A lot of the sources that we look at focus on members of faith groups that are more traditional. They might not include atheists or agnostics, so we will be looking at expanding our sourcing for that group in particular. I mentioned earlier that nationalism was a big trend in 2016. So when we looked at actions of nationalist political parties and actions of nationalist organized groups, we saw that there was a slight increase worldwide of these types of groups targeting religious groups in particular. So this does not include any sort of nationalist activity that focuses on race or on culture. It is solely focused on when these groups specifically target religious group members. What we found is that about 1 in 10 countries around the world had nationalist political parties or politicians that would target religious groups, but a third of European countries had these types of political parties. So it was particularly prevalent in Europe, despite it existing in certain Asian countries, in India, for example. A lot of it was a European phenomenon. And what you can see from the graphic is that mostly they targeted Muslims. It was religious or political parties really focusing on Muslims, sometimes Muslim migrants and Muslim immigrants in the country as well. So to give you an idea of some of the incidents that we captured in 2016, in France, for example, Marine Le Pen in her presidential run called for continuing the ban on religious clothing, but specifically tied it to political Islam in the country. In the Netherlands, Geert Wilders' Freedom Party, a right-wing nationalist political party, announced an election platform in 2016 that specifically included de-Islamization of the Netherlands. In Denmark, the Danish People's Party is a national right-wing political party, but they focused more locally. So for example, in the city of Randers, was passing a bill to make traditional foods the norm in public institutions and schools. And traditional schools included pork products. So groups like Muslims and Jews typically do not eat pork products. And the Danish People's Party was actively backing this measure at a local level. And Germany is an example of where these types of groups were picking up steam. So the Alternative for Germany Party is a right-wing nationalist group that in the past has called for the ban on construction and operation of mosques in the country. And they picked up a significant number of seats in 3 different local parliamentary organizations. And in 2017, they actually picked up additional national level parliamentary seats. So that was government. This is social groups now. So these are nationalist organizations, social groups that really focused on religious groups as the target of their ideologies. Again, you can see this is just a list of European countries. The majority of countries around the world, so 32 countries around the world, had these types of organizations that were active. 25 of them were in Europe. These are just EU countries that had these types of groups, or Western European countries, I'm sorry. You can see again, Muslims are the primary targets here. These are social groups in the country that have specific nationalist ideologies and call out religious groups as a threat to that ideology. So as an example, the Czech Republic had 20 different anti-Islam rallies by the group Bloc Against Islam. And in Spain, sort of directly tied to the terrorist attacks in Brussels in 2016, you had a nationalist organization called Madrid Social Home. They posted large signs outside of a major mosque in Madrid saying, "Today Brussels, tomorrow Madrid," posted things like "Mosques out of Europe" on Twitter and so on. In Ireland, you had the expansion of these types of groups. So the organization Patriotic Europeans Against the Islamization of the West is quite active in a lot of different countries in Europe, but they established an Irish branch in 2016. Similarly, the Soldiers of Odin group particularly focuses on migrants and immigrants and is a street vigilante group, and they also focused on Muslim migrants. And they opened up they spread to multiple cities in Finland and were also in Estonia in 2016. So this gives you a sense of how nationalism as an ideology not only impacted religious groups via political parties and organizations, but also through social groups, individuals at a more local level as well as a national level. So with that, I will wrap it up. If you guys have any any questions, if you have any questions about certain countries, I'll do my best to answer them. We cover 198 countries, so forgive me if I don't know off the top of my head what a country's score was, but I'm always happy to get into it afterwards, and I look forward to talking more about this.
Thank you so much. This was incredibly helpful. I'm sure we all have a lot of questions. I'm just going to start off the conversation. And I would love it if you would tell us a little bit more about the indicators. So when we're talking about government restrictions, you mentioned a couple of the indicators, but what are some of the other questions? What are we really looking for? What are you looking for? And what are, if you could just tell us maybe a few more of those questions that you're looking for to really try and understand what's happening.
Yeah, so you can sort of think of it as three different categories. We look at laws and policies, so things like, does the government have an official religion in the country? Does it have freedom of religion in the Constitution? Does it qualify that freedom of religion in a certain way? Those are all different indicators. Then we have more actions and discriminatory actions. So do they harass members of religious groups? Do they ban proselytizing, ban public preaching? Do they restrict worship in certain ways? Do they restrict conversion? So those are more discriminatory actions that the government does against religious groups. And then we have also favoritism in various ways. So does the government give resources and funding to certain religious groups while excluding others? Do they offer registration benefits to certain religions? Do they have funding for education, for property, for other types of clergy training in the country, religious education programs, all that kind of stuff. So we cover a very wide range. They all sort of count for the same amount. So whether a country gives funding for religious education or a country harasses members of a religious group, seen as a restriction nonetheless, and it can be redefined by researchers however it fits their data best.
And then the same for social hostilities.
Yeah, social hostilities is much more incident-based than government, so you don't see as many laws and policies factor in, but it'll be things like, did social groups allegedly harass religious group members, and specifically which religious groups? Were there tensions in the country between religious groups, and did that tension escalate to violence? Were organized groups in the country trying to dominate life in the country with their perspective on religion? And then as religious groups as the perpetrators, so were religious norms used to justify violence against people in the country? Were people's dress, were people harassed for wearing religious dress, or were they harassed for not wearing religious dress? We look at both sides of that question. Were people harassed for proselytizing or for converting in the country? That's nearly all of our questions, I think.
Oh, that's really helpful, absolutely. That kind of goes, I guess, to the methodology. Maybe if you could talk a little bit more about that. I know at the Religious Freedom Center, when we're working with either religious and civic leaders or educators who are not familiar with this information at all, and we're trying to just give a very brief overview about some of the trends. A question that always comes up is the methodology, and so we always say, you know, go look on the website, you know, because I'm not an expert at that, but it's really important. But for those of us who are asked that question, what's the most important thing that people in the community should know about the methodology that would kind of help them to see that this is very thorough information?
Yeah. So I would point to a few different things. So the extent of sourcing that we use, so 18 different sources. Yes, they are all English language sources, and that's a question that we get often, is that you're only looking at English language. We did do an analysis of more local level Spanish language newspapers in a country, and then compared the scoring that we would get from that versus what we would get using our English language sources. There was not a big difference. So we feel pretty confident using the sources that we do. They are, we do vary them as well between government sources, NGO sources with different viewpoints. We don't focus just on the opinions of one organization. So there's that. Then the double-blind coding system, where two different coders will code the same country and then compare their answers independently. We also ask coders when we hire them if they have particular knowledge about a certain country, if they have life experience in a certain country. We do not allow them to code that country if they say that they do, and that is to prevent any sort of bias coming up. I myself have roots in Iran. My analyst on the team is Bangladeshi. I do not check the coding for Iran. She does not check the coding for Bangladesh. We try to keep it very unbiased in general. So all of that to say, this is all subjective information. It's all qualitative information. We do our best to take any of that assessment out of the sources. Oftentimes in sources we will see commentary. We will exclude all of that. We go with conservative estimates. So if it says that many were killed in an attack, we assume many is 3. We don't go to 100. We don't estimate a number out of thin air to go with that. So unless the source tells us a specific number of people that were impacted, we don't make that conclusion ourselves. And so our numbers are the most conservative that they could be for a country. Other than that, it's a pretty standard content analysis methodology that you're essentially taking words and subjective opinions and then whittling them down to just a number. And sometimes you lose the nuance when you do that, and that's why we try to color it using anecdotes from the reports, try to illustrate what a score of 9.5 actually means in person. And we also encourage people not to necessarily compare countries to each other. China has a very high level of government restrictions, so does Saudi Arabia, for completely different reasons. They have the questions that led to those scores for those two countries couldn't be more different. And so just because a country has very high levels of government restrictions doesn't mean that they restrict religion in that country in the same way necessarily.
I have a question about nationalism, because that seemed to be one of the big trends that you were picking up. And what are the major takeaways that you see in the data in terms of the role that nationalism has kind of on government restrictions, but then also in social hostilities? And how are you seeing that those are impacting each other? What's the story? What's the takeaway from that? And can you compare countries? If most of it's happening, it seems like, in Europe right now, can you compare that, or do you really suggest that we look at each individual country on its own?
You can compare it a little bit. I mean, you see instances of the same group, for example, extending to different countries. You see instances where politicians will draw on the words of other politicians in other countries and start these types of nationalist ideologies in their own country. So there is a little bit of comparison and a bit of a thread that you can look at between especially European countries. I would say we did notice that in countries that had nationalist political parties and activities, you also had nationalist social groups going on, and vice versa. We don't know if one's causing the other, but certainly it makes sense, I guess, that in these democratic countries, if politicians are espousing certain ideologies, that those ideologies are likely reflected in the voter base at some level. And that they feed off of each other and vice versa. And perhaps those political ideologies came from social groups, and perhaps social groups are taking their cues from politicians as well. Something that we saw in the US, so outside of Europe, so you are all familiar with the Muslim ban, with Donald Trump's words during the campaign, those all were included in our coding. So the US was coded as having a nationalist politician targeting religious groups in the country. It also had nationalist social groups that were targeting religious groups, but differently. So in the US, it was mostly Jews being targeted by neo-Nazi groups, especially Jewish journalists being targeted and harassed. So not quite a direct correlation. A lot of the anti-Muslim attacks that we saw in the US were not necessarily attributed to nationalist organizations and parties. So we did not feel comfortable coding that, making that assumption. So I guess to answer your question, it all is sort of related and it's sort of not related. You can't definitively say that one is causing the other, but the fact that they tend to exist in the countries simultaneously seems to suggest that they are feeding off of each other in some way.
Are you in the midst of working on 2017 right now?
We are about halfway through our coding process now, looking at 2017 citations. Don't want to promise you when it'll come out, but probably in the spring sometime is when we'll have our updated results. Yeah.
All right, I know there's so many questions here, so I will keep my questions here for later on if we have time, but please want to open it up to the group. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you for, I learned a lot. I was taking notes. You're a good teacher. You talked about government, national, and the social. Is there like a combination index? Because, I don't know if it's top down or bottom up, the way things happen in a country. I was born in India, I'm here since 1970, so. But I'm a Muslim, I married a Hindu woman. And my father-in-law was actually the commissioner of police in Bombay. He said, whatever you guys do, don't come back to India. So, it's just, and then I was kind of surprised to see India #3. If you Google it, you'll find it is the most religiously intolerant country in the world. And sometimes you have this image of Gandhi, who's not a very popular person anymore in India. So my question was, because these things I find in a country like India, here in America we have problems, but at the same time, after 9/11, the law enforcement was guarding our mosque. And then people were coming out wearing hijab. I'm involved in interfaith work. It's tremendous support. So socially, I feel that I don't feel uncomfortable. However, at the top we have problems. So my question, again, to shorten my long narration here, is there a combination? For example, in India, of course, you have riots, and then the government is supporting rather than stopping. And so social, and then it's a nationalist government. Hindutva, you're familiar with that, what their concept is. So a new coding to combine all three.
Yeah, so we sometimes will combine government and social scores together to sort of look at an overall score for a country. But we do find this interaction sometimes. Actually, I was just running some numbers. These aren't official Pew published figures, but I was looking at what indicator for government restrictions is the most likely to cause an increase in social hostilities in a country. What's the most correlated? Actually, it was surprising. It is the indicator that we have of whether the national government responds to incidents of discrimination against religious groups in a country. And that reminds me of what you were saying, that in India, it's not that the government themselves are perpetrating some of these crimes, it's that you have complaints of them not acting and not responding to these incidents. And so it's an interesting case in which you have very high levels of social hostilities in India, the highest in the world in 2016. And then you also have evidence of that response from the government. In other places, government favoritism of a certain religious faith also is highly correlated with higher levels of social hostilities. The US is an interesting case. We, outside of this work, have done surveys of religious groups in the US and surveys of the general public and their views of religious groups in the US. And something interesting was that in 2016, or in early 2017, right after the 2016 election, we each year we do a feeling thermometer is what it's called. So a score, we ask people to say, how warmly do you feel about a religious group between 0 and 100? And typically Muslims are the cooler end of the index. I think right above or right below atheists is how people feel about Muslims in the US. But there was a slight warming of feelings towards Muslims in the US right after the election. Don't necessarily know why. Could have been that they're very contentious political race and people felt more warmly towards those that were targeted. We don't know why.
Because Muslims are working hard.
Perhaps
I just
it could
finished
be
writing a
advocacy
book on
efforts.
Muslim neighbors, so
Yeah.
hopefully that'll help a little.
Yeah, so you do see increases in hate crimes towards Muslims for sure. In 2016, there were post 9/11 levels of hate crimes against Muslims, but at the same time, you see public sentiment sort of warming toward Muslims as well. So.
Yes, sir.
Hi, thanks so much for your presentation. I'm interested in the links between this persecution that you're highlighting and changes in religious demography in a country. So, I think in these nationalists, in these countries that you highlight in Europe that have these, recent rise in these nationalist parties, it's pretty clearly connected to, immigration from the Middle East and perceptions that the traditional religious makeup of the country is falling apart, right? So I was just wondering if you looked at or had any insights into the way into the connections between changes in religious demography and changes in social hostility or government hostility.
Yeah, so on the macro level, the amount of migration into these countries is so small that it's hard to statistically sort of draw a correlation. But last year's report, so not 2016 but 2015, focused on, 2015 was the year in which really the refugee flows into Europe hit their max levels. And what we found was that in Europe, so much of the religious restrictions were focused in on this incoming flow of migrants, typically Muslim refugees as well, or we don't necessarily know if they were Muslim, but people assumed they were Muslim or they were coming from Muslim majority countries. So it was certainly something that we saw cropping up, that people were saying that we would only let in Christian refugees into a country, that we are a Christian country, and this is going to have an effect on our culture as a country. And so having that occur in 2015, and then in 2016, seeing this uptick, especially in Europe, in nationalist groups that are really focusing on religious groups, it does definitely seem like there is a connection there. I don't have the numbers necessarily to tell you that what the exact correlation would be, but definitely anecdotally, I would say that the change in religious demography in the country is impacting, even though that change demographically is not impacting the country is still very much Christian, right? Very much, Europe is very much white still. It's not, these numbers are not big enough to impact that in general. We did do a recent report on opinions in Western Europe in particular, and really looked at nationalist ideologies in Western Europe and whether we sort of created a scale that looked at nationalism and views towards immigrants, views towards migrants. And interestingly, the thing that was most highly correlated with having high amounts of these nationalist feelings was having a Christian identity, whether or not you're a practicing Christian or you're not a practicing Christian and that you attend church or not. Saying that you are Christian was the most highly correlated with having these nationalist ideologies. Now, we don't know why. It could be that nationalism is bringing out these sort of historically Christian identities in Europeans. It could be that Christianity, something about Christianity itself is feeding into these nationalist ideologies. We don't know. I'm not the lead author of that report, so I definitely encourage you guys to go check that out. It's up on our website. There's a lot more information about that there.
Thank you for your wonderful report. I actually would have thought that the language of the leader, like the language of the president, would have a great impact on the population. And for instance, when Trump had talks about Muslims or talks about the other, the Southern Poverty Law Center has basically said that has actually given people license to discriminate or to harass or even be violent against Muslims. But did you find did you ever were able to break out between what the leader says and what the impact on the population is?
That's interesting. Off the top of my head, I don't think that we did that specific analysis. I know that there were certain countries where we saw these types of activities and it was the actual leader, the head of state of the country saying it. More often than not, it was politicians in smaller political parties, more right-wing, that might have been winning more seats, but they weren't the head of state, for example, saying it. In terms of the incidents in the U.S., I know the SPLC's hate crime statistics I think they actually saw quite a large surge right after the election. And granted that their data are different from the FBI's data, I think the FBI likely undercounts the number of hate crimes in the country just because of their methodology. But certainly, as a whole, when you looked at 2016 and then 2017's hate crime numbers, it was basically, you saw 9/11, there was a spike, it went down for a decade, and then it spiked again in 2016 and even more in 2017. So it's an interesting juxtaposition that you have those types of incidents going on, but then at the same time, the general public is reporting that they feel sympathy towards Muslims, that they feel a general warmness towards Muslims. And Muslims themselves, when we did a survey of them in 2017, right after the inauguration, they were saying that they have been met with increased levels of support from people in their community, that they have, people have given them outward showings of support, that they are very proud to be American still. So it's an interesting juxtaposition, definitely.
Thank you so much for the report. I have a question and then I need an advice. That's why I come here. So my question is, I'm native of Somalia, US citizen, and we are of course impacted firsthand with the Muslim ban. Two of my family members were impacted. One, a doctor, young lady, educated in China, was not allowed to come in here, join her husband. One. Two, my nephew who came in, and it was just when the Muslim ban was put on hold by the judge, he just happened to come in that time. And it was, actually he was stopped at the Dubai airport. So then with that period of time, he was able to come in. And so thankful for that. So we are impacted firsthand, and families are now, divided. So what is that, my second question is, with the report that you guys work very hard and do it, who benefits it? What do you do, or is the policies made out of that where it benefits people like us who is discriminated towards or against, with a right wing? And then what do we do other than vote, which we're gonna make sure? What do we do to defend, I guess, or speak on behalf of the discrimination? What is your advice other than, go vote, go vote?
Yeah. So I think that the main audience for our report, we try to not only appeal to the general public, the informed and interested public in religious freedom issues, but also policymakers. People at the State Department generally are very interested because one of the large sources that we use is the State Department's Religious Freedom Report, so to synthesize that into numbers is usually very interesting for them. I myself have done trainings for foreign service officers, people who are being trained to go work at embassies around the world. And so I'll do a training session on religious freedom issues in various countries so that they can sort of get an idea of what's going on around the world. In terms of advice, I can't necessarily give you advice, just as an employee of Pew, but I would say that we like to have advocates and religious freedom advocates or religious freedom NGOs, especially in DC, encourage them to use our data, to look at the specific countries that they're interested in, that look and see what specific indicators are going on in that country, and what changes have occurred in that country in the past 9 years of data that we've collected, so that you can really hone your message and focus in on that. In terms of the Muslim ban, I'm sure that will crop up in our 2017 coding. We actually haven't gotten to the US yet, so I can't tell you whether or not it does, but I'm sure that it will. In 2016, incidents hadn't yet occurred. You did have then Republican nominee Trump say things to that effect, and so that did get coded in our 2016 numbers, but the actual actions did not occur until early 2017, and so that's not included in this report specifically.
Yes, go ahead.
I'm Farnaz Isfahani from the Wilson Center. My question to you is, did you in any way look at the rise of populism even among elected democracies? Oman's Hungary, Turkey's Erdogan, India's Modi, etc. did you look at a correlation between these populist fascists being elected and that leading to more religious discrimination and less religious freedom?
Since we look annually, we're not able to look really fine-grained at here's the election and then here's the 2 months after and here what the incidents look like. In the case of India, since Modi was elected prior to 2016, we did witness an uptick in Hindu nationalist, for example, activities among social groups, a lot of cow vigilante groups that would target consumers of beef, typically Muslims in the country. We did see increases in that case. But basically, to answer your question, we can't make those correlations so specifically just because our data generally are annual, that they say in this past year, this is how many incidents happened, or this is what it was. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi. I'm curious as to whether or not, when you were looking at the European nationalist movements to persecute the Muslim populations there, particularly the Muslim populations, if you did any correlations with whether they corresponded to incidences that the migrants had inflicted on those populations. In other words, does the rise in the nationalism correlate with the rise in the hate crimes and the violence the other direction from the Muslim community to the general population? Because I know, for example, in Sweden, there's a very strong populist movement in their current upcoming elections, but it's a direct reflection of their rape crisis. And in the UK, they've had a lot of bizarre stabbings with the, from the really, really extremist community that they're trying to vet out. But, with which would be under our rules, hate crime motivated types of violence. So did you do any sort of analysis that way?
Generally, it was a more rare to see incidents of migrants perpetrating crimes and then that being cited as the reason for these types of nationalist ideologies. A lot of times, so we would capture incidents, for example, if it said that a Muslim migrant attacked such and such individual, that would get captured in our coding generally. But oftentimes the nationalist ideologies that we saw, they would focus on 1 or 2 incidents of a crime occurring by a migrant to justify their nationalist ideologies, but we did not, again, sort of the previous question, since our data are annual, we can't necessarily look systematically at, okay, this event occurred by a migrant and then these were the responses, and that this is a statistical correlation. Anecdotally, it came up sometimes, but I would actually say that by and large, these incidents did not necessarily spur on a lot of reaction, the exception being incidents of terrorism. So in 2015, for example, right after the Bataclan shootings, right after the Charlie Hebdo shootings, you did see increases of social hostilities, but typically those would target Muslims in the country. So it was not increases in social hostilities perpetrated by migrants. They were typically the victims in the incidents that we did see.
Hi. So it's pretty clear the extent to which the government restrictions index can be used by policy analysts to create recommendations, but do you have a sense of, or can you give a sense of how the social hostilities index plays into policy recommendations, or what is the vision kind of for how it could be used?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think oftentimes the types of social hostilities in a country will vary. So in Africa, for example, sub-Saharan Africa, you see a lot of violence being used to perpetrate religious norms. And so that specific type of activity, sometimes it's female genital mutilation, sometimes it's child marriage. Things like that are very specific policy goals that governments might have around the world, or NGOs might have, that they can then focus on those countries that had those specific incidents. For social hostilities, terrorism factors in, so areas that have terrorism that is specifically religion related, so that's either terrorist groups themselves that have a religious ideology, or terrorist groups that target religious locations or individuals specifically. So that obviously for policymakers is pretty salient usually. But just our general number of incidents of social hostility against religious groups, and then looking specifically at which religious groups are targeted, I think that is sometimes useful for people that want to say, okay, well, what was the situation like for Jews around the world? And there were 10 more countries in 2016 where Jews were harassed. Where are those countries? What's causing them? And then they can dig deeper in the data to see, is it because organized groups are pushing their views on religion in the country, or is it because Jews are being targeted by other religious groups in the country, and so on. So I think it is maybe slightly less directly relevant than the government restrictions index at times, but given the correlations between social hostilities and government restrictions, I think people often find the policy usefulness, I guess, in the SHI and the social hostilities index as well.
Any other questions? Go ahead, sir.
Curious if there's ever an issue of separating out religious problems with race problems, a la purity, etc. You must confront that from time to time.
Yeah, we will often see in our reports that this is likely a religious, but could also be an ethnic issue. We will typically look for explicit mentions of religion in an incident. We, sort of by that same token, don't exclude an incident. So say that a Jewish man was stabbed on the street walking home from groceries. We don't know the motivation of the person that attacked him, if it was purely a crime of if he was being mugged, or if it was a crime because he was visibly Jewish. And so we assume it's because he was visibly Jewish, because that was noted in the report. Oftentimes it appears in the religious freedom report from the State Department, so we assume a certain level of religion being relevant in that case. We don't assume religion based on ethnic group, so even if an ethnic group is largely Muslim, and then a member of that ethnic group is targeted, we don't assume that that one individual is Muslim. We look for a specific mention of their religion or of a religion-related type of fact in the data. But yes, that's a good question, because it does come up quite often in sub-Saharan Africa, where religious and ethnic lines are very closely linked, and so we try to be as specific and as detailed as possible.
Hi, do you work with any other organizations, or do you know if people in I'm particularly interested in if there's a correlation between LGBT discrimination and the discrimination you find. So are there other organizations that use, other LGBT focused organizations that use your research, or do you work with people or other organizations for that?
So we don't partner with other organizations on this data, so I'm not sure of who exactly is using it. I will say that we often don't end up capturing incidents of LGBT violence in our data, because a lot of times religion is not specifically mentioned. So if the religion of the perpetrator is mentioned, and that is the reason why they targeted an LGBTQ individual, we will count that incident. If the religion of that victim was known, then we will count that incident. But it's not something that comes up quite often in our data. So I can't necessarily speak to how useful it is for the LGBT community. And since we don't partner with really any organizations on this, I don't know how it factors in, but I will say generally as a human rights issue, it is relevant for countries, because often places that will have strict religious freedom laws might also restrict things like LGBTQ rights in the country as well.
You know, we just have a couple of minutes left, and you all have asked such great questions, and I guess before we end, is there any good news? Is there some good news? This is the 9th in a series of reports, and are there some trends, are there some countries that you've seen some really great progress towards religious freedom that it's just worth highlighting? Can you think of any?
Definitely like this.
Antarctica.
It's great over there.
Move to the Arctic.
So there's, from year to year as well, you could expect that there's not going to be a miracle case of a country that just overnight, in the course of a year, improves their score. I will say what we do measure from year to year interfaith dialogues that occur, that are hosted, facilitated by the government, anti-discrimination policies that are passed by the government. So we will see small improvements. Improvements are also hard to track because often in the reports it just means that something's not reported. So if there was discrimination one year, people talk about it in the reports. If there wasn't discrimination, they just won't talk about it, but they won't necessarily say that like, these are the things that ended up happening that led to this. So sometimes it just means that the slight lowering of the score really represents vast improvements by the government, vast efforts by the government. We'll see small iterations like Vietnam, for example, still very high levels of religious restrictions in that country. So by no means are they a huge success case, but they in 2016 eliminated the requirement to have religion listed on identification cards. And so that led to a small decrease in their score when it comes to making it easier for people to convert from one religion to another. So maybe not the best success case, but small things like that, I think. I'm trying to think of any other off the top of my head, but the good news is often one that it's hard for us to highlight when everything is focusing on the restrictions. But maybe the fact that social hostilities didn't decrease, but it didn't increase in 2016, so maybe that can be some comfort.
Is there anything you can maybe, as you look forward to really releasing the next report sometime probably next summer, are there things that we should really look for in this new report? Anything you're kind of picking up on the data right now where we just really need to wait until the new report comes out?
Probably generally need to wait just because we haven't looked at every single region around the world. But I will say that typically things don't change all that much from year to year. I mean, you would imagine, especially with government restrictions, laws don't change that often. And so you have a lot of sort of steadiness. But there are pockets in which, that you see in the news, that you would expect that we're going to see higher incident rates of detentions going on. So I know that Turkey, for example, we're already seeing higher numbers of detentions in Turkey in 2017 compared to the year before. My guess is that in India, we will probably also see increases in the numbers of people that are impacted, and particularly by Hindu nationalist groups. So some of it is what you would probably expect to see. I think I'll have to wade through the data a little bit more to tell you about any surprises that come out.
And what's the best way if we have questions? Well, first of all, where can we get the report if we don't have it? So where can we get the report? And then if we have questions, what's the best way to contact you or your team? Is there a way to engage with you to talk about and to figure out the best way we can use the data and the work that we're doing?
Yes, for sure. So our report is online, pewresearch.org. There is a whole page for our religion project where you can find not only this report, all the prior years. You can find our public opinion surveys of religion in the US and internationally. And then if any of you are statistical whizzes, you can download the data set as well, rerun the numbers as you see fit, etc. So that's where all of that is on our website. To contact me, this is the best. So my email, kkishi@pewresearch.org. @Katayoun Kishi on Twitter as well. If any of you guys are journalists and you want some sort of media interview, we have a whole communications team as well that you can do media requests through. But we always encourage people to reach out if they have questions about our data. Myself, and then also any other reports that we do, our researchers are always really happy to answer questions from people who are interested in our work. I definitely encourage you guys to look through the report, and there's multiple appendices in the back of the report that list out every single country's score, every single country's individual scores on each different indicator as well. If you're curious about what a conversion looked like in Nigeria, that will be listed there. So enjoy.
And these graphs and maps and
those are all in the report as well.
Okay.
Yeah. And if you'd like to use our graphics in your own publications, we are happy to let you do it as long as you credit us, then feel free.
Yeah. Dr. Kishi, thank you so much. And thank you all for coming today. And thank you for a gracious host.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.